Hi, my name is Steve Jones. I'm the preaching minister at Vero Christian Church in Vero Beach, Florida. Our process for making disciples is to love God, love people, and serve others. Today I want to talk for a few minutes on loving people through small groups. There is a biblical precedent for small group methodology. One of our guiding principles in the Christian church is to base our practice on the precedents set by the churches that we read about in the Bible. We call it doing Bible things in Bible ways. Now, you know what a precedent is. A precedent is an example or a model set for others to follow. For example, when Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, he and his family began Inauguration Day in church, in prayer and worship. Why did they do that? They did that because it is a presidential precedent, going all the way back to James Madison. James Madison and his family began Inauguration Day in church and prayer and worship. Since then, every Inauguration Day for every president has begun in church, in prayer and worship. Well, likewise, we believe in having a biblical precedent for what we do in the church. We read that the New Testament and look for examples and patterns that those first churches, under the guidance of an apostle, set for us today. There is no command in the New Testament to use a small group methodology, but there is a New Testament precedent for using a small group discipleship methodology, and I want to lay it out. Now first, Jesus used a small group discipleship methodology. Jesus attracted large crowds of followers, sometimes numbering in the thousands. But Jesus instructed and sent out a smaller number of about 70 disciples to preach and heal in the surrounding towns. And then Jesus personally mentored an even smaller group of 12 men to be leaders of the church that he was creating. What do we call these 12 men? We call them Jesus' 12 what? 12 disciples. In Luke chapter 6, verse 13, Luke records, when morning came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, whom he designated apostles. Also, some would add that even within this group of 12, there was a smaller group of 3 men, Peter, James, and John, with whom Jesus concentrated even more attention and training. Jesus used a small group methodology to train leaders and lay the foundation for the kingdom of God, the church. Now, secondly, we see that the early church had a small group structure as reflected in their use of houses. The church started off with a bang, with no less than 3,000 baptisms in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. And from that point on, it only got bigger. And for a while, before the Jews turned against the church, the Christians were able to use the temple courts for their large assemblies. But even then, they were making use of their homes for fellowship, worship, and evangelism during the week. Again, Luke records in Acts chapter 2, verse 46. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. Also, the picture of the early church that we get from the New Testament letters indicates that while there was one church per city, sharing a common eldership and treasury, that church was divided into small groups that met in the members' homes. Here's some examples. Romans 16:3. Paul writes, greet Priscilla and Aquila, also the church that meets at their house. Colossians 4:15. Greet Nympha and the church in her house. Philemon 1:2. To Archippus and to the church that meets in your home. During the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, church buildings did not exist. So it was necessary that people met in homes. And my point is that there is a precedent for small groups in the practice of Jesus and in the structure of the early church. The small group dynamic was alive and well from the very beginning of the church. When we implement small groups for Bible study, worship, ministry, even evangelism, we're getting back to or restoring New Testament Christianity. There's also a personal benefit to small group methodology. Solomon writes in Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. The personal benefit of a small group methodology can be summed up in one word: growth. Sunday church worship grows our love for God through the Word and prayer, the Lord's Supper and fellowship. All of these elements are present in a small group Bible study, but with the added dynamic of relationships with other Christians. And we need close interaction with other Christians to grow. God is concerned with creating the church as His family. 44% of the New Testament letters are about how we should get along with each other. Now consider the number of times the words one another occur in the Bible, particularly in Paul's letters. The Greek term appears 59 times as a command. Now, these commands instruct us to encourage one another, love one another, confess to one another, pray for one another, accept one another, serve one another, bear with one another, forgive one another, teach one another, be devoted to one another, honor one another, spur one another on to love and good deeds, to be humble toward one another, offer hospitality to one another, and so on. So participation in a small group Bible study provides the context in which these instructions can effectively be carried out in close spiritual friendships. Now you might say, but Steve, can't we do all those things just by coming to church and worshiping on Sunday? The answer is no, or at least on a much more limited level. One lady took her granddaughter to church for the first time, and as they knelt in the tall-sided pew, the little girl whispered, "Who are we hiding from?" It's easier to hide in a crowd than in a small group. In fact, a lot of people want to hide in church for a while as they check things out. We call it flying under the radar. They do that because they want to check the church out before they draw any attention to themselves, and to see if we handle snakes or smack people on the forehead. You're kind of like that show, undercover boss, sneaking around and seeing how things work, and we understand that. I grew up going to church, and back in my day, the preacher had guests stand up every Sunday. Can you imagine? We just don't do that here. On Sunday, you can be as involved or as uninvolved as you choose to be for as long as you choose to be. But when you join a small group, now, your cover is blown. You are off the sidelines, you're in the game. And that may sound scary, but remember, it's more fun to play the game than to just watch while the players take the risks, because they also enjoy the benefits. So the early Christians grew spiritually by entering into deep friendships with other Christians in their homes, wherein they shared their beliefs, experiences, their possessions, their meals, their victories and setbacks and problems and prayers. That's just a little less likely to happen in the context of a large worship service than it is in the context of small group Bible studies, or what we call life groups. If we spend this next year committing ourselves to involvement in a life group, we're going to grow. We're going to grow in patience, because some of those group members haven't honed their social skills. We're going to grow in joy, because joy is doubled when you share it. And we'll grow in peace, because sorrow is diminished when someone helps you to bear it. We'll grow in knowledge of the Bible as we listen to the insights of others. And self-awareness, because others will help us with our blind spots. We'll grow in love, because we will receive more love from others and demonstrate love to others in practical ways. In hospitalities, we have the opportunity on occasion to open our home and host the group. There's simply no substitute for the small group experience. Now, there is a great love potential in small groups. Luke records in Acts 4:4, but many who heard the message believed, and the number of men grew to about 5,000. So far, we've been talking about growth in terms of individual spiritual growth. We haven't really been talking about the numerical growth of the corporate church. And I believe one leads to the other. The way to grow numerically is to grow spiritually, the men and women who make up the congregation. New believers joined the church last year because of the people who had dedicated themselves to pray and read scripture and serve in a ministry and participate in life groups. God makes things grow numerically as well as spiritually. And as long as we continue to emphasize a small group approach to our church organization and infrastructure, our potential to reach others is hypothetically unlimited. As God brings more and more new people into our midst, they're going to need an environment where they can pray and study and teach and be taught and learn and serve and belong and build spiritual friendships with other Christians. As the church gets bigger, it must get smaller. 4 out of 5 churches in North America never break the 200-person barrier in attendance. Why is that? One reason is because they think the preacher is their pastor, the primary spiritual caregiver. So if there's a marital problem, go to the pastor for counseling. If someone's sick or in the hospital, they send for the pastor for prayer. If someone is lost, then the pastor can teach and baptize them. A single individual working full-time can only function as the primary spiritual caregiver for about 200 people maximum. And even then, he won't do it well. So the preacher as pastor becomes a bottleneck, and the church hits a ceiling in its growth. What needs to happen is a paradigm shift in the church. The church returns to the New Testament pattern where we have a plurality of spiritual caregivers or shepherds or pastors in the church. And in addition to the elders, we have a network of small groups where people are connecting and relating and ministering to each other. 10 to 15 people represent a reasonable span of care. And our challenge is for more and more of our members to embrace the idea that if you're going to provide an environment of loving spiritual friendship to the growing number of people who need it, you need to get on board with life groups. There are house church networks in some persecuted countries numbering in the hundreds of thousands of people. A woman invited some folks over for dinner, and at the table she turned to their 6-year-old daughter and said, "Would you like to say the blessing?" The girl replied, "I wouldn't know what to say." And her mom said, "Well, just say what you hear Mommy say." So the daughter bowed her head and said, "Lord, why on earth did I invite all these people over to dinner?" I'm going to let you in on a dirty little secret. That's the way a lot of church leaders feel. On the one hand, they're glad to see people saved and joining the church. On the other hand, they're thinking, I can't adequately care for the spiritual needs of the people who are already members of this church, much less another family. Isn't that sad? That's what happens when you try to have a handful of people do all of the one anothering in the church. But if the discipleship process is complemented by a system of small group Bible studies, life groups, then you can absorb as many people as the Lord sends your way. So we encourage you to join a life group or to host a life group. Eventually, maybe even lead a life group. In this way, people who are not yet saved and not yet church members can also be discipled. They can be educated, assimilated, and cared for with an unlimited potential for growth. Thank you.